Looking for a fun, different new shirt? Something related to the things you like? Climbing in the outdoors, perhaps philosophy? Visit our new store, The Dihedral Goods, on Etsy, and you'll find all that and much more.
I'm on! Roll! Hello, everyone. This is Carrot, welcoming you to another episode of the Dihedral Podcast. If we asked an AI to develop the perfect person for the show, the result would be today's guest, Dr. Kimbrough Moore. Kimbrough is an author, rock climber, and philosopher who can be found teaching philosophy at San Francisco State University and climbing all over the great state of California. He's written 3 guidebooks, including Golden State Bouldering, Yosemite Bouldering, and Black Rock Bouldering. Among other pieces, Kimbrough has co-authored work on a unique topic regarding the experience of reading. When he's not delivering the goods academically, Kimbrough can be found on the rocks, where he has accomplished feats in the 514 and V12 ranges. I couldn't be more pleased to have the chance to visit with Kimbrough Moore. Kimbrough, welcome to the show.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going good. It really is great to meet you. We follow you on Instagram, and you're always posting really very interesting ideas, like thought out and well-formed. And then we actually became aware of you when you posted on something regarding gender bias in grading routes. And I was hoping that could maybe be a good place for you and I to start to chat. So can you explain a little bit about what that is and why it's problematic?
Of course. Yeah, the main idea is that there's a gender bias in climbing grades. And the bias is that the grades are more accurate for men or anybody with your average male body. I have been kind of working with these ideas for about 10 years. It's Black Mountain Bouldering.
Oh, yes.
This is my first guide. I wrote it with Ian McIntosh. It's an wonderful area up in the mountains in Southern California. And I realized that the grades, although grades are always things people debate, but they generally worked for me. I get a bunch of people together and we talk about grades, and we'd be maybe 1 or 2 off, but really no more than that. And it felt like just a kind of friendly difference of opinion. But there are other climbers there who often weren't a part of those discussions. And one of them was a friend who was about 5 feet tall with the negative ape index. And there were V10s and 11s that she could do and V5s that she couldn't. And that blew my mind. Just the idea that something that was like half of her maximum was literally impossible because she couldn't make the reach. So our like, what is it? Solution in that guide was to not include grades at all. So it's all grade ranges, these color codes. And it's kind of like polarizing. Some people like it, some don't. I think it's kind of fun. It fits with the history of the area. But since then, I've done more research on it. Kind of looking into who are the people doing the grading. And as it turns out, from a number of different metrics, it's mostly a bunch of men. Usually like 90+% men are the ones who are doing the grading. And what has happened is that they have kind of not unintentionally like built the average male body into the grading scale itself.
Right. Yeah, that's frustrating. I like that that kind of spectrum of grades that something could be. I haven't seen that in a lot of guidebooks, but you do see that starting to bleed into gyms a little bit. I've had, it's just another little anecdote, a friend who is a competition climber, and she's tiny, less than 5 feet. And she's a great climber. An excellent climber. And there was one particular route she couldn't even start it because she was too small to do it. And certain things like that eliminate people from even the possibility of accumulating money sometimes or sponsorships in other areas. So I think it is a problem. And despite looking at a spectrum and trying to figure out for ourselves, I think it's something that climbers will get used to. And I think hopefully we should get used to it. If you were going to go back and rewrite some of your guidebooks, what changes would you bring in, if any?
Yeah. So going back to something you just said, which is around like the role that grades play. You know, when I give talks on this topic, I started off by asking, you know, there are always some people who think that grades are, you know, total bullshit, and it's just about the ego. And I asked them to leave. You know, they're too pure for this conversation.
That's great.
I don't want to corrupt their like, you know, wonderful, beautiful souls by
That's
talking about the
great.
nitty-gritty of grades, because there aren't like there isn't a boogeyman in this story. There's not some bad guy other than maybe just like some kind of like hand waving towards just general societal sexism.
Yeah.
And so the solutions aren't straightforward either. It's kind of like, you know, different depending on the context, you know. I've got a bunch of ideas about what I would do differently. For example, I think that in one is to really take seriously the limitations of your own experience. Um, you know, while my experience, which my experience, by the way, all of our experiences, but I'm just talking about mine, it
Yeah.
puts me at the center of the universe, right? Because like
Right.
every experience I've ever had has me as like the middle,
Hmm.
as the focus of it. That's just the nature of our experiences. So it can seem like these experiences we have are like universal,
Right.
when really they're not. And the only way to find that out is to like have conversations and really take seriously the like experiences of others or the things that other people say about their experience.
Yeah.
Uh, and
That's
so
great.
what I would do differently is to include more people in those conversations around grade.
Awesome.
And if someone's got a different body than mine, they're taller, they're shorter, they've got smaller fingers or whatever it is, to like not try to come to a consensus necessarily and to just let there be different answers to a question like, how hard is this climb?
That's great. Another thing that you talk about sometimes is the approach, which I think is important too. You know, the idea that an approach is an hour. First of all, I've never had an approach that I haven't gotten lost on. So an hour sounds great. Normally it's like 8 hours. But what you're saying about grading seems to apply to approaches as well. And so you have offered some solutions online about what you would do differently in describing an approach. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, if I were to kind of like, I don't know, summarize the main theme of a lot of my work, it's been this idea of kind of ex like realizing the limitations of your own experience and
Mhm.
being open to other people just having a different perspective entirely. And not trying to solve, not thinking that that as a problem or as like something to argue about or to end up agreeing on, and just to see it as if your goal is to like capture the difficulty of a climb or to describe how long it takes to get to a climbing area, then you're going to want to actually describe the differences that people have.
Yeah.
So in writing Golden State Bouldering, so it's my recent bouldering guide. I think it came out 2 years ago to the SF Bay Area. I worked with this group called Para Cliffhangers, and it's a group of para climbers. And I I, in meeting with them, I don't know, it's one of those moments where I just felt very, in retrospect, even in the moment, I felt very dense. I was
Mhm.
like, I'm not understanding what you're saying. I was meeting with this great climber, Elliot, and Elliot kept telling me to stop putting in walking times and to just describe what the trail is like, you know, a
That's good.
quarter mile hiking through Talus, or 1 mile on a wide paved trail, whatever it is. And he says, you know, let people decide, like, let people evaluate for themselves how long it will take. Because if somebody's in crutches, you know, Talus might be impossible. And so
Right.
they're going to want to know that. And if it takes you 5 minutes to get up it, that's completely irrelevant information for them.
Man, that's such a good point.
Uh, and I kept not getting it. Like I would send drafts because Para Cliffhanger is like kind of add an accessibility section in each area. So I kind of describe the like
Yeah.
accessibility considerations. I kept sending drafts and Elliot was like, stop. Like you keep putting your own evaluation on it, saying things like it's wheelchair accessible. Like, do you know that? Like, have you seen somebody, have you talked to someone who took a wheelchair up there? I'm like,
Yeah.
no, I haven't. He's like, stop doing this. So it took me a dozen times to really get it. But what I needed to get was stop evaluating, just describe what the trail is like, and then people can make their own assessment. And what I think a lot of what I've done in the past, and I think a lot of people have this experience, is there's just a approach time in a guidebook, and it's always way shorter than it takes you.
Oh,
It's like a
always.
universal truth, right?
Yeah, it is.
And it's because guidebook authors, usually when they're writing a guidebook, they're in shape because they're like getting out there all the time to finish this book, and they know exactly where they're going.
Right.
And they also might like not keep the best records, even of how long it take. I know for me, like everything feels like 20 minutes, and sometimes the approach is like 45 minutes, and I still
Yeah.
feels to me like it's 20. And so it's not that guidebook authors are wrong necessarily. I mean, there are some instances I know I have in my own past of just being wrong, but typically it's that they're taking their how long it takes them, you know, and they're kind of generalizing this to everybody else. And that's just not true, and that's not useful information. And so it's not useful information for other people because they want to know how long it'll take for them. And it's
Yeah.
also not what the guidebook authors are trying to do, right? Guidebook authors are not trying to just describe how long it takes for me. They're
Right.
trying to tell people how long it will take for them to get there. And
Yeah.
so it's not just about like helping others. It's like, you know, us authors are not even doing what we're trying to do because we're trapped by our own experiences.
Man, you think about a guidebook and you're like, just give me the information, but it's not just the information. You're right. You got to have these perspectives that try to include everybody. That's a challenge that I don't think most of the readers really think about. And so, yeah, I think you're right. Guidebook writers could do better, but probably a guidebook readers could be less judgmental when, it says an hour, like maybe an hour for them. Yeah, that's great. I wanna kind of stay on to some work that you have talked about a little bit, something called the Kimbrough code. Um,
Mm. It's the bro code.
it's just the bro code.
It's
All right,
just
that
the
makes sense.
bro code.
But it's okay, good. Yeah. What is the bro code? I mean, it's not BRO, right? It's
BROUGH.
yeah, there it is. So can you
Yeah,
talk about
yeah.
the bro code for us?
I mean, it's my ethical list. It's my series on Instagram on climbing ethics. Uh,
Yeah.
and the way that I've like published on ethical philosophy, and it's um, the way I do ethics is I don't believe that there is one theory that captures everything.
Yeah.
I think that our moral intuitions, like our kind of gut feelings or kind of instantaneous judgments about right and wrong, they don't form a coherent set. There's often contradictions within us, and
Yeah.
those contradictions end up kind of playing out in our moral theories. And so I think that each theory, the main ones get something right, but they're also leaving other kind of important intuitions out. And so I tend to be a pluralist, you know, it's kind of like, what is the series of, let's take seriously this idea that we could like be good climbers and this kind of like holistic sense, and not just good at climbing, but like good people who are climbers. And like, what would this series of rules look like? Yeah, so that's
That's
the bro
great.
code.
Can we get a couple of them? Let's hear a few.
Uh, yeah, you know, let me see if I can get these right from memory. You know,
Okay,
one of
yeah,
them
yeah, there's
is
pressure here.
what uh uh one of them is if your climbing partner, if a climber is excited about their climbing, you should be too. You know,
I I agree.
it's so often that someone's excited and other people are so quick to kind of give their own judgment on the person's accomplishment, like it was soft,
Right.
or I did it in less tries, um or I didn't think you could do it. That's one of my
That's
favorites
rough.
because it's like such a backhanded compliment, right? Or it's
Yeah.
like,
Like you're
thanks, I
terrible.
think. You didn't think I
Congratulations, though.
could.
Yeah, that reminds me. There's this idea. It's basic. I mean, it kind of pushes the same notion, but it's like don't yuck someone's yum. When somebody's enjoying something and you don't like it, that doesn't give you permission to let them know. Like they're enjoying it. Enjoy it with them. I think that's a great piece of advice. The bro code is so far so good. What's another one?
Um, uh, be a hype man.
Oh, that's
Like
great.
hype people up, you know. Um, I liken it to, so all of these are kind of based on, you know, kind of extensions on theories from academic philosophy. And for hype man, I always think about a Confucian sage.
Oh,
So we're
cool.
talking like classical Chinese Confucian ethics. And Confucius kind of gets this rap as like a, I don't know, stodgy traditionalist or kind of like political or social reactionary.
Yeah.
And there's like a lot of truth of that in the Analects, which is his book of philosophy. But there's also, but if you take serious, like if you really try to understand this idea of what it means to be a sage or to be like a virtuous person and the effect that they have on people around them, there's this notion in the literature of a moral charisma, where like a sage kind of has this like effect on the room around them that makes everybody better off. Like they are
Yeah.
better people for being around the sage. And I think that a hype man does this for climbers. I don't know, you've probably been out there. That one person who's just like so enthusiastic about
Yes.
your climbing that even when you don't believe in yourself, you
Yeah.
like you believe that they believe in you, and that's what gets you up.
That is the best. Absolutely, man. I feel like gyms should hire somebody just hype climbers up. They don't have to check anybody in or like do the shoes. Like just go up and encourage people. That it's infectious too. Like when new climbers come into gyms, they get conditioned based on what we do, and so if they see that around, I think that will encourage them to do it as well. There's a lot of different moral considerations that we face in climbing. And one of them is this idea that maybe not leave no trace. That might be asking a little bit more than we're capable of, but at least not try to be overly destructive. And so I was actually thinking about this today. Ethics, as you know, and anybody who thinks about it knows that it's difficult. It's very tough to be like, this is black and white. There's no gray area. Here's right and wrong in every situation. And so I saw a video of um a family, maybe it seemed like a dad, maybe an uncle or something, and a little girl, and they just were pushing these boulders off of a ledge, and people were losing it. They're like, you this is terrible. And so we of course start to judge people based on right or wrong regarding how they act, whether it's defacing rock or knocking things over or even like damaging petroglyphs and things that we value and probably should value. But as I got to thinking about it, I was like, when I clip anchors on a really hard rock, I'm really happy that rock was defaced at least to a certain degree. And
Mm.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, is that just a hypocritical thing for me to judge somebody who's knocking over some rocks, but also like thankful that somebody's drilling into a rock face just a few hundred feet away?
Um, is it hypocritical? Well, let me simmer on that while I answer another part of the question, which is
Yeah,
which is that, for people, I don't know, have you done much route development?
not much, no.
Okay. So, well, so you're climbing outside and you walk up and there's this like beautiful rock that's all ready for you to climb. If you're doing climbing sport, it's got bolts in it. The loose rocks probably being removed. There might be a trail going up there and a nice flat kind of space to put your backpack down on. If you're bouldering, there might be a nice landing. Even if you're doing trad though, like the lichen's probably gone from the rock, it's been brushed. Like there's a lot of
Mhm.
work that goes into making a rock fun to climb.
Right.
Um, and so and so there's it's it's I don't want to say there's that the rock is always changed by climbers, but it's usually changed by climbers, and that change is required for it to be an enjoyable experience.
Yeah.
So there's no kind of this kind of distinction between like, untouched nature and, I don't know, civilization, I think is often pretty blurry. And what you get are these like curated nature spaces. And I
Yeah.
see climbing rocks are curated nature spaces. And so I wouldn't say it's exactly hypocritical to like, a family just being destructive, pushing like trundling big boulders. But also I've been climbing 35 years. I was a teenager in the 90s. Like
Yeah.
I've trundled plenty. And so, with the bro code, like I don't come from a place of judgment really, because everything I'm saying you shouldn't do, I've done at some
Yeah,
point.
exactly.
So I'm not like kind of holier than thou. Trundling can be really fun. But it's also, I think, potentially dangerous and disrespectful. And, if everybody did it, then life would be much more dangerous at the bottom of a cliff. And
Sure.
so I don't think it's a good idea, but I also don't necessarily like fault a family for it makes sense to me how a family could enjoy pushing big rocks off the top of a cliff and watching it crash down.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that same kind of enjoyment at being around the rocks and seeing how they move and, watching, like, staring down like sheer face for like hundreds of thousands of feet. Like, that's very much a part of rock climbing.
Yeah.
That
It's
family needs to be like redirected with their energy.
I,
Yeah.
I
Don't push
like
the
that.
rocks down, instead climb the human up.
Exactly. You'll figure there's a balance there. So, um, there's I don't know, there's a lot written on the history of Yosemite and Yosemite Valley and the climbing there, and it's a rich history and it's fascinating, and I really enjoy reading about it. Um, there was a lot of, I don't know if you want to call them moral rules, but there was a lot of rules that were established there that were really, really important in setting a precedence for how routes would be developed. And you're a California climber. How
Mhm.
much were you influenced by some of the rules that came from, the old days of climbing at Yosemite and sort of balanced themselves out and sort of, not only California, but all around the country and eventually the world? How much did that influence you as a climber, as somebody who writes about climbing and just is immersed in the climbing world?
Yeah, I lived in, so I've written a bouldering guide to Yosemite, and I've also lived in Southern California and climbed the Joshua Tree a bunch. And a number of the climbs I did, you could still see the like effects of the bolt wars, back when
Yeah.
rat bolting was, forbidden. And there would be like somebody would like Scott Cosgrove would rat bolt a climb, and then someone else would come back and smash off all the hangers because that you should be establishing them from the ground up.
Yeah.
Um, I always found a lot of those rules to be quite silly.
Mhm.
They always seem very arbitrary. Aesthetically, I didn't agree with the kind of a judgment about what climbing should be, that
Yeah.
was going on behind them. And I generally ignored them, ignored the rules I don't like.
That's pretty good.
These rules are kind of funny because if you try to push someone on why you can't rat bolt, it's very much going to be just like an aesthetic judgment. By aesthetic, I mean kind of a judgment about like what the value of climbing is or what beautiful climbing is.
Yeah.
And people are going to inevitably disagree with those things. I think when I look back at the history, I don't think it actually fares that well. We can like, I don't know, we can tell these stories about people getting in fistfights, over bolting in like the parking
Yeah.
lot of Joshua Tree. And yet, like, that's messed up to be getting in a fist fight over rock climbing.
That's
Like
true.
that is
Yeah, that's
indicative
true.
of a super toxic culture, that climbing had at the time.
Yeah, that's a
And,
great point.
and so going back to the bro code, one of them is to make climbing larger, freer, and more loving. Like in many ways, I am the status quo in climbing. I'm like a white guy who's been climbing for 35 years. My dad was a climber. I was a competitive climber. I did like national, international competitions back when I was a teenager. Um, I've written guidebooks. I climb hard. Like I am the status quo. And yet I don't advocate for like diversity or accessibility or kind of more inclusive grading for other people. Like I'm also doing it for me because I've got a vision of what I want climbing to be like.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, it's just better than it used to be. I know it's not like, I don't know. I seem to hear more often climbers grumbling about how climbing's losing its soul or, whatever the words they use. But I remember climbing in the early 90s, and like it had more men, it was wider,
Yeah.
it was straighter. And it like all those things I think were holding climbing back as a community.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's such a good point. We tend to do that, right? We look at the past as if it was somehow glorious, but it might have been glorious for some people, but definitely not everybody. That's a great point. You you I don't know if you're afraid or not, but it doesn't seem like you're afraid to put yourself out there and like promote your ideas. And sometimes that comes at a cost. I know sometimes people will respond to you or say things in a really negative light. And sometimes you talk about it, but I'm sure in most of those cases you don't talk about it. And so I was wondering if you can talk a little bit or share a little bit about how like negative commentary, not constructive, but truly negative, affects you and what you do or how you respond to people who just seem to be trolling you.
Yeah, it's funny. So in the last year, I've really been putting energy into my Instagram account. Um, um, Let me think of how to answer that.
Yeah.
I think partially I have a lot of experience. You know, I'm a professor, and so I'm used to speaking to an audience that is mildly hostile, but mostly like disassociated. These are my
Yeah.
undergrads.
That's great.
And they're not all like that, but like an intro class
Yeah.
can be like that.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of used to that. And you know, one of my colleagues at SFSU, SF State, is Arzu Islami, and she says that philosophers send love letters to each other through criticism.
Oh, that's nice.
And so this idea of criticism is very much like I've got a pretty big capacity for criticism.
Yeah.
I like it. And in fact, if people only say nice things to me, I start getting like skeptical. I'm like,
Yeah.
are you lying to me? Or do you just
Come on,
have, are
honest.
you just not able to see all the flaws? Uh,
That's great.
you know, when Yosemite Bouldering, the guidebook came out, my co-author, one of my co-authors, it was written with Shannon Jocelyn and James Lucas. And Shannon and I, when we got the big box of books, we got a bottle of bourbon and a red pen and just like, you know, marked the whole thing up, all the things we would do differently next time. Uh,
Yeah.
so I like criticism, and I don't feel like everyone has to agree with me. In fact, I would rather, if someone disagrees, I'd rather they say it and kind of
Yeah.
give their justification and be open to hearing like different ideas and alternative viewpoints than just kind of going along with what I say. Um, at the same time, I don't like trolls. They irritate me. They're adding nothing to the conversation. They don't care about truth. They don't actually have any investment in, for example, climbing grades. They don't have any investment in climbing grades being better.
Right.
And of course, climbing grades, we made these. These are not like something that was discovered out among the rocks one
Right.
day. Like we made climbing grades, we can make them better. I see no reason to just be okay with them being inaccurate for women and youth and para climbers and tall climbers and short climbers and just anybody who, this is most of the climbers, by the way, right?
Right.
Anyone who
Yeah,
doesn't
of
have an
course.
average male body. So so I get a lot of I do get some hate. You know, earlier today, somebody like blasted a bunch of comments on a post saying I was a serial killer and a narcissist. Uh,
What?
and this isn't a post saying that like, you know, if you're gonna solo, like think about the people around you who are watching you. Like they
Sounds
might not want to watch somebody solo. And I'm not saying don't solo, because I grew up in a culture where I started soloing when I was 16 with my dad. Like
yeah.
this, like soloing is a part of climbing, that's true. But it's usually something you do kind of like off on your own in the mountains,
Right.
not at like a busy sport crag. So that was, I mean, I thought
Sure.
this point was so non-controversial when I recorded the video that I didn't think I was really saying much. And yet here it's so controversial to some people
That's
that, you know,
wild.
they're calling me all these names. And in the process, this person also said that Stoic philosophy wasn't an ancient philosophy. And I'm like, this is
Right.
from like 300 BC.
Yeah.
This is like your like stereotypically classic ancient Greek
I
philosophy.
know. I was just gonna say, yeah, tell that to like Zeno or some of the
I know,
ancient historical
tell
ones.
that to Zeno, man.
Yeah.
In the Stoa.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh, and so I'm pretty quick to block people online or to restrict comments. I
Yeah,
think if someone's not adding to the conversation, they shouldn't be a part of it.
that's great.
If someone's disagreeing with me, I'm all for that. But at some point, someone isn't, you know, is no longer sincerely engaged, and I don't care.
Yeah,
I don't care what they think.
that's great.
If you're not trying, then I don't need you to be not trying around me.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, I think that that feels like the right attitude. So I'm sure, it's got to be hard for a lot of people to do that. But I think you're right. As a philosopher, I mean, we thrive with criticism and we look at it as a way to get better. And when that's not what's happening, then why continue the conversation? That's awesome.
Yeah, and you know, the way you get, I mean, my experience, the way you get good at the communicating ideas is you have the same conversation 50 times. And eventually you kind of like your ability to articulate your own thoughts and also the clarity of your own thoughts in your own head actually improves from that. So I like having disagreement. That's why my views are as are as um I don't know, like detailed or accurate as they are, like that kind of as developed. That's the way. That's why
Yeah.
my views are as developed as they are, is because of all the disagreements. Um,
Along the way, yeah.
to go back to your other question, like your kind of initial question around like negative comments.
Mhm.
I think I also just as I've gotten older in climbing, I don't climb as good as I used to. I'm not sure if I mean I'm only 40, but I've been climbing like as long as I can remember. So I was better in the past. And part of it's like choice, you know, I know what it takes to kind of maximize my abilities and I don't want to do that. It's a
Yeah.
lot of work. And part of it is I just don't get as much meaning out of pushing my own limits. And so I think a lot of that energy and kind of my passion has gone into like what kind of climbing community I want to be a part of and what I
Yeah.
want to see around me. And so it makes me have less patience for meanness, for treating other people poorly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the climbing community isn't perfect, but it's generally good. I mean, I really enjoy it, and like you get a lot, like the encouragement and like the support and things like that. And of course, there's people who are new to climbing who maybe aren't ready for that. They're more competitive, or I'm going to beat you, or something like that. But I think the conversation is important because I think that we should try to protect those good things that we do have, like those community aspects and supportive aspects. And if people want to be competitive, that's fine. But to expect that other people want them to be competitive is not a great feeling. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. Do you find that climbing influences your philosophy and philosophy influences your climbing? And if so, how?
Um, yeah, what is the relationship there? You know, over the years, I've had almost any like orientation towards climbing you that people can have. I have had at some point. As like I've gone through the like different developmental stages of my own life while climbing the whole time. I think I've
Yeah.
only taken the longest break, I think, was during the pandemic, and that was like 3 months, I believe.
Yeah.
That's in the last 35 years. My longest break has been 3 months.
That's amazing.
Uh, so so I think one of the this is one of the main roles that climbing has played in my life is just a moment to like get away from everything else. You know, I'm not a smoker, but like I understand why people smoke. You know,
Yeah.
it feels good and it looks cool. It's got those going for it. I mean, it also does like, you know, lower your life expectancy, but you know, you can't
Yeah.
win them all.
There is that.
There's that. But it also forces you to take a step out of like a social situation so you can go for a smoke.
Yeah.
And like like stepping out of your like either the moment if you're like in a party or something or at a bar, or taking a step out of like the list of tasks that you have to do on a daily or weekly basis and getting out in the rocks. That's been really like beneficial for me. So I think that this idea that climbing is like a part of my life in which I can kind of step away from it in order to get perspective and reflect on everything else that's going on for me. Um, I'd say over the years, that was probably the main role that climbing has played.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a great history of climbers who encourage going for a walk just to like consolidate their thoughts. And climbing can do that same thing. And then, so I want to talk a little bit about the experience of reading. That's such a fascinating topic to come up with, to write about. And I read your paper that you have posted on your website, and I
Oh,
strongly and thank you for posting that, by the way. A lot
yeah.
of times academic papers are like really expensive to get our hands on. So I encourage anybody who's listening to check out both the website and the paper. But I was wondering what inspired you. It's hard to come up with a topic that's not well versed or well written about, and it's I don't know if it's new, but it feels new. It's not something I see everywhere. So what inspired you? And I was wondering if you can give maybe a short synopsis of what that topic is about.
I'd love to. So let's just talk about what is the question? Here's the question.
Yeah.
What do you experience when you read? And so everyone who's hearing this has read at some point. So just think back to the last time you were reading something, and then what was your experience like? And I'll give some options here. So first, do you experience an inner voice? Maybe like your own voice or someone else's voice or a character's voice, kind of like speaking in your mind, you know? We call it like an auditory experience. Um, Another option is, do you see visual imagery of some sort? Like kind of like pictures or a movie in your mind? Do you kind of like imagine what the characters look like? Not just imagine them in the abstract, but like actually have an image of what they would look like. And do you see the words on the page? Or do you kind of like take off into the story so that the actual words are kind of transparent? Well, what do you experience when you read, Carrot?
Yeah. So when it's so cool. Like the way you set up the paper, you kind of start off with that question, and immediately I'm just like, what the hell's happening to me right now? And so it feels tricky. It's just really difficult for me to be like, this is what I'm experiencing at this moment. And I don't know if it's, we come with a history, and so immediately I'm thinking about, okay, do I read like a story of fiction much differently than I read philosophy? And then I start thinking about like Wittgenstein and all these things with language, and I'm just like, what exactly is going on? And so it seemed like when I really focused and thought about what I picture when I read a fiction, it does seem like there's a story, like pictures, that almost like a creative aspect to what's going on. When I read philosophy, it's like a more like an internal dialogue where it's just like I'm having this conversation with myself, and then I pause, up here, whatever that means, to respond to that conversation before I keep going. And so I think it's sort of, at least for me, depends on what I'm reading. Philosophy seems to be very different from reading fiction, where one is more conversational and one is more like I said, like a movie. And there is some overlap, right? Because there's certain pieces of philosophy where there's very detailed thought problems, and that gets me back into that movie. So for me, at least, I don't have like words at any point floating or doing anything where I'm just seeing letters put together. But conversations and pictures is probably the way that I think I do. But again, it's a trippy question to ask yourself for the first time.
Yeah, one of the reasons why studying consciousness like this is tricky is because it's called the refrigerator light problem. I don't know what area of philosophy you do, so I'm going to clap in a moment, and so when I clap, I want everyone who's listening to answer the question about their experience right before I clapped. Okay, here it goes. Before I clapped, were you experiencing the tactile feeling of your left foot in your shoe? So of course, everybody is right now.
Right, exactly. Like, wait,
But what about before I clapped? And there's no, so this is called the refrigerator light problem, right? You like when I was a kid, I'd want to know if I didn't name this, but when I was a kid, I'd want to know if the refrigerator was on and the light was on in the refrigerator. And so you'd open it and the light's on, and you close it. You're like, but wait a minute, is it on when it's closed? And eventually you like stick your face right next to it, and I remember learning there was like a little plunger in there that would turn the light on and off.
Yeah, totally.
We don't have that gap when it comes to our own experiences. So every time you think about an experience, you can make it happen just by asking the question, am I experiencing my left foot in my shoe? But of course, we've got this, and that's interesting, but what were we experiencing before we were actively thinking about our own experiences? So yes, the question is weird. And one thing I noticed is that about the experience of reading is that when I would talk to other people and read what other like philosophers, psychologists have written about it, none of it seemed correct to me.
Yeah.
We've got Bernard Bars. He's an eminent psychologist who came up with the global workspace theory of consciousness. And he says that everyone is experiencing an inner voice every moment of the day, including like right now. All of you are all experiencing inner voice. And I'm like, I'm like, really? Am I? I
Yeah,
don't think I am.
great.
And he didn't have any experiments on it. He just kind of like saw it to be so obviously true that you don't need to run an experiment. Everyone's clearly experiencing inner voice. And I believe it's true for him,
Right.
but I don't think it's true for everybody. And one feature of me is when I read, I don't have an inner voice or visual imagery.
Yeah.
I mean, I can. Like if you ask me to do it, I can do it. So it's not like I'm confused about like what it
Right.
would mean to have an inner voice, but I have to like actively decide to have an inner voice. I don't just have it automatically.
Yeah.
Uh,
It messes with you a little bit, at least with me. Like
yeah.
after you read like the opening sentence of your piece, it's just very difficult to continue reading without distract, at least for me,
I
without
know, right?
distracting myself.
I had
Great.
moments like that too.
It's great. So that's
Uh,
interesting. So
yeah, so the
no,
the
go ahead.
answer, the answer I did run, so it was a piece of experimental philosophy, so kind of using the tools of psychology to answer a philosophical question. And the answer is people experience all kinds of things. It's like
Yeah.
it's not a sexy conclusion after spending what I was working on this dissertation for probably 6 years.
Yeah.
I had a very eventful 6 years. Writing a climbing guide, for example, at the same time. But I know I spent 6 years working on this, and the conclusion's not sexy. It's messy.
Yeah.
And I think that, I'm generally distrustful of an academic work of like clean, uh, sexy conclusions because I
Yeah.
think the world generally is just kind of messy. And yeah, that's what the experience of reading is. It's different people at different times, depending on what you're reading, have different experiences. And if we want to like accurately describe what our experiences are while reading, we have to give kind of a messy answer, in which it's kind of always changing and it depends on the context.
Yeah, that's a perfect summary. It's a great paper. So again, thank you for making it
Oh,
available. That was really kind.
thanks.
So Nick Bostrom's got this new book out, Deep Utopia, and I was reading it. It's a really interesting book. I recommend it, I guess, for anybody who's listening. But it's like a 7-day lecture essentially. And then there's fictional characters who comment on the lecture after each day. And I don't know exactly which day it was. Maybe actually, I think it was Wednesday. Three
Okay.
these three characters are having this dialogue, which as I was reading it, I was like, this was Kimbrough Moore. Like this was so good because they were talking about the experience of reading, and I'm like, man, this is such good timing for me. And then they get into
Interesting.
this discussion, which maybe you can comment on if you have any thoughts.
Yeah.
They were, written by Bostrom, and so there's like, how do we know that we aren't part of a story? How do we know that people aren't reading about us, right now? It's kind of experience machine-esque
Yeah,
type
yeah.
idea.
Maybe you live in a simulation. There's kind of like
Yeah,
radical
exactly.
skepticism that goes back to Descartes.
Exactly. And so they were trying to come up with proofs to explain to each other how they can be sure that they aren't in a novel or a story, which of course immediately gets me into the conversation. It's like, all right, how do I know that I'm not in the story? How do I know that, you know, you and I aren't on the pages of somebody else's work or the listeners are? And so I'm wondering if and they offer a couple of really interesting proofs, which their proofs are that they're not, which of course from my perspective is that those proofs don't work because they are. I'm reading them.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
can you think of any way for us to at least, I don't necessarily say prove, but give an argument strong enough to suggest that we aren't the product of somebody's story as they're reading? I don't know. I think it's an interesting book about two climbers having a conversation.
I love it. I mean, I love the skeptical questions. When I was in high school, The Matrix, the first one came out,
Yeah.
and I saw it in the theaters, and I had it on VHS, and I believe that this is why I ended up going into philosophy. Like, I wasn't thinking at the time, The Matrix is so cool. I'm gonna make this my life.
Yeah.
But I believe that was kind of like in my unconscious. And of course, in the Matrix, right, we're people living in a simulation caused by these malevolent machines, and there's also like guns and trench coats and lots of style.
Yeah.
So so let's see. I think I've got kind of two answers. One is another paper I wrote along with my dissertation advisor and co-author is a wonderful guy named Eric Schwitzgebel. I want to plug his book, The Weirdness of the World. is his
Good
one of
title.
his newest books, and it's phenomenal. It's based on his blog. It's a kind of widely read blog in philosophy. He's got a real knack for like asking interesting questions in philosophy, such as, are ethicists more ethical than anybody
Yes,
else?
that was really good.
So we actually did a study together where we were trying to disprove the notion that the idea that solipsism is true. And so
Mhm.
solipsism is not exactly what you asked, but it's kind of in the same ballpark. And it's
Close
the
enough, yeah.
theory that nobody exists but me,
Hmm.
and that everything else is a figment of my imagination. And so we actually ran a series of experiments to disprove this experimentally, which is kind of like, you might think it's kind of silly because, as you mentioned, well, maybe the experiments themselves are a part of this like elaborate like imagination of my own.
Yeah,
Uh, and yet it's one thing to be distrustful of my experiences or skeptical of my experiences, and another to be skeptical or distrustful of like the scientific method itself
mhm.
or my current or even just what my experiences are in the moment. So maybe I'm thinking, hey, it could be a dream, so I'm not really talking to you, Carrot.
Yeah,
Uh, but that is different, and that is different than having than saying, hey, but I do know I'm having the experience of talking to you.
right.
So we actually run some experiments. One of them was playing chess. So I cream Eric in a series of chess games, and he was trying to win though. And so we kind of ran some stats on it. It's a little tongue in cheek, but the idea here is that there was a intelligence that was independent of his experiences that was nevertheless better at chess than he was,
Yeah, right.
which is evidence that it's weirdly experimental evidence that there is something out there beyond
Pretty
his
good.
own kind of stream of experiences in the moment.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a great test. I love that. Like, I'm not
Now,
good enough to beat myself. This is how good I
exactly.
am.
Now, it doesn't get you, I mean, it gets you, I mean, it could be your unconscious. And so it doesn't get you like the
Yeah,
external world exists or anything. And it doesn't speak against this question that you initially raised that perhaps we're just a part of a story.
yeah.
Um, but to go back to the story question, I mean, I've kind of got two answers. One of them is from Zhuangzi. So I've really gotten into uh, the Chinese, like classical Chinese traditions.
Cool.
Um, and they're fascinating. So Zhuangzi is an early Taoist, and I don't know if you read the Tao Te Ching. I actually don't.
A
I mean,
long time ago.
philosophers, people don't realize this. People think that philosophers just love everything, but like we have preferences.
Oh yeah,
Like I
that's for
just
sure.
don't like the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have to like everything.
No, uh, but I do like Zhuangzi. He's kind of the like rebellious grandchild of the Tao
Oh,
Te
that's
Ching,
neat.
and he's very much a skeptic and he believes in kind of pretty massive relativism. But
Yeah.
he would say, I mean, he has the classic uh, passage you might have heard. He woke up, having dreamed he was a butterfly,
Oh
and
yeah.
then wondered, am I a philosopher who dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he's a philosopher?
Classic. Yeah.
And for Zhuangzi, he doesn't care so much that you agree with him. He cares about the impact that doing philosophy has on your life. And so it's sometimes called therapeutic philosophy as
Oh, cool.
opposed to doctrinal philosophy. I think this about when you ask the story question, I think there's value in just asking these kinds of questions for
Yeah.
the way that we engage with the life and potentially taking our lives less seriously. Um, that is independent of having an answer.
Right. That's great.
So I'm happy to kind of like play around with it. But I always go back to David Hume, and when David Hume wondered, if you know radical skepticism is true, that I'm massively wrong about everything I think because I'm being controlled by an evil demon.
Yeah.
After spending, I don't know, 20, 30 dense pages of philosophy asking that question, he ends with, I don't know, I don't care. I'm gonna go back to playing backgammon.
It's perfect.
And yeah, that's how I feel when I hear the story. The story, like, it's fun to think about. And then I'm gonna go back to my life, kind of
Let me get
assuming
back on the
that,
wall.
all of this is real.
That's great. Uh, I'm wondering if you can help, just the general population of climbers out. Let's say that there is, I don't know, a conference or something at San Francisco State, climbing philosophy conference, and you're tasked with, I don't know, entertaining a few of the guests or a few of your colleagues, and you're going to take them out to a crag that maybe isn't too far away, and then take them to a restaurant. So if you could pick one place for visitors to come where you're like, this is where we're going to climb and this is where we're going to eat, what would you recommend?
Okay, let me think. So going to the climbing, the Bay Area is blessed in so many ways, but amazing local rock is not exactly one of
Not
them.
there.
I mean, having written a guidebook on it, you climb on the rocks you have, not the rocks you wish you had.
Yeah.
And so here's what I would do is that I would schedule it so that we're doing a long day trip or weekend to Yosemite first. Yosemite's
Perfect.
3.5 hours away. That place, it makes me feel like there might be a God.
Yeah, that's great.
There's just a powerful wildness about Yosemite Valley that it takes my breath away every single time I drive into the valley. So we'd go there.
Perfect. Done.
For a restaurant. Give me a moment.
Yeah.
I'm gluten-free, and so I'm actually
Perfect.
quite limited in
Great. I'm a
my
vegetarian.
restaurant.
So
I
like
also don't eat meat. I know.
throw that into the limits of what we
I
got to
don't
cover.
I don't eat meat. Okay, here we go. So I'm assuming it's a conference in which it's probably funded
Yeah,
by
let's go with that.
by somebody who's not me or us. And so we're gonna go to this cute little we're gonna go get caviar. Yeah.
Nice.
I technically call myself a caviar-tarian. I don't eat meat and I haven't for God 15 years now,
Yeah.
but I love caviar.
All right, let's go.
It's so good. It's like salt and butter had a baby,
That's
and
such a good description.
then sadly they had to cut it out of a sturgeon.
Yeah, exactly.
But we go to one of a number of like wonderful caviar places because that's the most delicious thing I could think of.
Perfect. I say like let's spotlight them. What place would you recommend that we go to?
Mm-hmm. There's a cute little spot called Absinthe
All right.
in San Francisco.
That's it. We're climbing it. I like how I threw myself in the scenario, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yosemite.
Come on, man, let's go.
Then we're going back to absinthe. That sounds great. All right, Kimbrough, I got one more hypothetical for you. It might be too much to ask, but we'll see how it goes. Let's say you discover a crag. I already named it for you, the Kimbrough Crag. There's only 5 routes there.
I named it after myself. Okay. Okay, yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I named the bro code after myself, and
Not
I worried that was
self-interested.
too narcissistic. Someone else said it is maybe, but it's also good branding, so go for it.
That commenter who called you narcissist, apparently they were right. All right, so we'll just say I named it for you, but you got to name 5 routes. Doesn't matter what types of routes they are. You're just going to come up with 5 names of 5 routes in the Kimbrough Crag.
Okay.
All right, let's hear them.
You want me to name them right now?
Yeah, right now on the spot.
Oh man, so the hard part about this is that I get climbing name anxiety,
All right.
where I freeze and I question myself. So some people have a knack for like the
That's true.
poetry of naming climbs, and like weirdly, I don't. I find it very emotional
Yeah.
to like put a name and then I second guess myself afterwards. I feel this way around writing like meaningful cards, like birthday cards for people too.
Oh,
I have to like a part of my process is to
that's
like
so
use this
nice.
is I stressed out about it for like a day or two and put it off until I've only have like 5 minutes left to write it and then I just write it quickly.
All right.
And I'm the same way here. So I can't give you an answer
let me give you
because
some
it's not
guidance.
like it's not a part of my process, Carrot. I haven't stressed out about it for long enough to be able to name 5 climbs.
What if I limit the wall? Let's just call it, and there's a few of these around. Let's just call it like the philosopher's wall or something like that. And you just need to name routes after 5 philosophers that you either find interesting or don't. Like if you don't like the route, you're like, you know what, this is person X. So if there are 5 philosophers that you would name a route after, who would they be?
Here we go. Before I say my first one, I got a question for you. You mentioned Wittgenstein. Are you into early Wittgenstein or later Wittgenstein?
So I have like ongoing issues with Wittgenstein, where sometimes I can be into and against pretty much any part of him. So that's like you naming a rod. It's really difficult for me to answer that
Okay,
question.
okay. Apologize
Yeah,
if I
no, no,
caught
no,
you
no,
asking
no.
that question. I'm all for. I think there are like people who are into the early Wittgenstein, and I'm very
Yeah.
much into later Wittgenstein. So we're gonna have one just be. It's gonna be just later Wittgenstein. That's
Oh,
gonna be
that's such
one.
a good name.
Yeah, yeah. We can
Yeah,
have
there
another
was.
one named Wittgenstein. We'll have a language game climb as well.
Ooh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's so
Um,
good. I love it.
then let's move to Nietzsche. I mean,
Perfect.
there's a bunch of climbs named after Nietzsche already, right?
Yeah.
Over at like Rifle, you've already got a Twilight. It was a Twilight of the Idols at Red Rocks. I think you have a Gay Science. That's a
Oh,
good one.
really? That's
There's
great.
a Gay Science at Rifle on the project wall.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so let's do we'll do Human All Too Human.
Great, man. Great. So what is that? Are we
We
counting that
got
as three?
three.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh let's shift to Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is really psychedelic. If anybody's interested, I prefer the Zipporah translation of Zhuangzi, but you can like buy it. It's like $15, and read it. And it's really trippy. It feels psychedelic.
Okay.
But we'll have the let's have the Equalizing Joke Book.
Oh, perfect. I like that. That's great.
And finally, who have I been reading recently? That's all I got.
That's
When my list is done, my list is done. I only
no, that's
got four.
perfect.
You
I
know,
feel like I put
that's the fifth one is symbolic. It's symbolic for the names that are yet to come.
I love that. I feel like I put a lot of pressure on you to be like, no, you got to do this. And you came through brilliantly. I
I
think.
need the pressure though. That's a part. I told you it's a part of
Yeah, exactly. So I one final question. Do you think there's a world in which there could be a conference based on the philosophy of climbing? Is there funding for that
Oh,
and
definitely. I'm actually
interest?
in the fall, I'm going to be a part of I was invited to the University of Minnesota to give a talk on philosophy of climbing.
Oh,
And so that's
sweet.
just one talk as opposed to a conference.
Yeah.
But there's definitely, I heard there's a new book. So there's been a book on the philosophy of climbing. It's got articles in there. It's got maybe a dozen different articles by philosophers. In my last guidebook, so the Golden State Bouldering, the Guide to the Bay
Yeah.
Area, the theme is the meaning of climbing, and it has articles by a number of climbing philosophers in it
So cool.
on kind of what climbing, not what climbing means to them, but what is the meaning of climbing itself as an activity,
Man,
including
that's
Bill Ramsey, Matt McCormick, and Bas van Frossen. So
oh
there's
man, that's
definitely the possibility for a conference on the meaning of on like the philosophy of climbing.
all right. If it, I'm gonna start looking for some funding here.
You're
Maybe
gonna organize
maybe
it.
we can set it
Yes,
up.
do it,
That would be
Carrot.
awesome.
Do
Kimbrough,
it.
thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really a pleasure. I had a blast. So before we go, is there anything that you want to plug or promote or something that we didn't touch on that you wanted to cover?
I think if anyone wants to stay in touch or follow me on Instagram, that's where I'm doing most of my this kind of work, this like public facing kind of intersection of philosophy and climbing. That's Kimbrough Climbs. So KIMBROUGHCLIMBS. And one thing I'm doing is I'm continuing to gather data on like gender and the people who are doing the grading. Right now, I'm looking at route setters for major competitions. Yes, it turns out that USA Climbing hasn't hired a woman to be the chief route setter for a major comp in 14 years.
Oh,
Um, and of the setters and the setting crew, so kind of working below these men, and like I said, they're all men. Only 13% are kind of certified to be women. So I'm kind of looking into the competition, like what is it? The different roles of competitions and who's actually like setting the challenges for our competitors. So that's my next project.
that's Excellent. Awesome. All right. I agree. Like, you should all be following Kimbrough for sure. It's enlightening. Kimbrough, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me here.
If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit thedihedral.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on.
Climb on!